The laughter echoed through the roadhouse, sharp and mocking. A group of young truckers leaned against the bar, smirking as they watched the old man sip his coffee. "Look at this relic," one of them chuckled. "Shouldn't you be in a retirement home instead of on the road?" The old man didn't react. Not yet. They had no idea who they were messing with. Have you ever seen someone underestimate the wrong person? Share your story in the comments. Like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon for more incredible tales from the road. The air inside the dusty roadhouse was thick, with the scent of fried food, cheap beer, and motor oil. A neon sign flickered weakly over the bar, casting a dim red glow across the wooden walls covered in faded trucking posters and old license plates. At the far end of the room, sitting alone in a corner booth, was Charlie Ironfoot Garrison, a trucker who had spent 5 decades on the road. His weathered hands gripped a steaming cup of black coffee, his steel blue eyes staring out through the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He had seen a lifetime's worth of highway miles, breakdowns, and bad deals. He had nothing to prove. But the group of young truckers standing near the bar didn't see it that way. They were young, cocky, and full of themselves. Their denim jackets clean, their boots barely worn from real work. They had just gotten their CDLs, and in their minds, they were already kings of the highway. One of them, a tall guy with slicked back hair and a shiny new belt buckle, nudged his buddy and chuckled. "Hey, check out Grandpa over there. What do you think, boys? Last of the dinosaurs?" The others snickered. One of them, a guy named Travis, leaned against the bar with a grin. "Man, what's a guy that old still doing out here? Probably takes him 2 hours just to back up a trailer." The group roared with laughter. Charlie didn't react. Not yet. One of the younger men, a blonde kid with an overinflated ego, took it a step further. He grabbed his beer, sauntered over to Charlie's table, and plopped down across from him. "Hey, old-timer," he said with a smirk. "Let me guess. You're one of those guys who thinks trucking was real work back in the day, huh? Bet you never even touched an automatic transmission." Charlie calmly took a sip of his coffee. The blonde kid leaned in. "So, how long you been at this, huh? Must have been driving when they still had horses pulling the loads." The group erupted in laughter again. Charlie exhaled slowly, setting his coffee cup down gently. He looked around the roadhouse, recognizing the same old cycle he'd seen 100 times before. Young, cocky truckers thinking they owned the road, thinking they were tougher than the generation before them. They had no idea what real trucking used to be. Charlie's silence only seemed to encourage them. Travis, still standing by the bar, called out, "Hey, old man, do us all a favor and retire already. You're just taking up space that real drivers could use." Charlie finally spoke, his voice calm, gravelly, and laced with experience. "You boys ever jackknife an 18-wheeler on an ice-covered pass in the Rockies?" The room fell silent for a moment. The blonde kid laughed, waving him off. "Man, that's ancient history. We got GPS and collision sensors now. We ain't got to worry about that old-school nonsense." Charlie nodded slowly. He had heard enough. He lifted his coffee cup again, taking another sip. They had no idea what was coming. Not yet. The laughter from the young truckers grew louder, their confidence swelling with every joke at Charlie's expense. The blonde kid leaned back in the booth, grinning like he owned the place. "So, what's your deal, old-timer? You one of those guys who sits around telling stories about the good old days?" He mocked, with an exaggerated drawl, nudging his buddy. "Let me guess you got 1,000,000 miles on the road, and all you got to show for it is a bad back and a coffee addiction?" The other young truckers howled, slapping the bar and shaking their heads. They were enjoying this. Charlie just stirred his coffee, his face unreadable. That only irritated them more. Travis, the one who had been leaning by the bar, stepped closer, shaking his head. "See, that's what's wrong with you old guys. You sit there acting like you're better than us, like you got some big secret to trucking that we don't know." Charlie finally looked up, his sharp blue-gray eyes locking onto Travis like a rifle scope. No emotion, no fear. The younger man faltered for half a second, but then covered it with a cocky smirk. "Betcha can't even handle today's rigs, huh? Automatic transmissions, lane assist though. You probably don't even know what an ELD is." He laughed, looking at his friends for approval. "I bet he still drives with a road atlas." Charlie took a slow sip of his coffee. Still no reaction. Travis's smirk faded slightly. The old man's calmness was starting to get under his skin. That's when he made his mistake. He reached forward and tapped Charlie's coffee cup. causing a few drops to spill onto the table. A small act, but a clear challenge. The bar went silent. Even the bartender, who had been pretending to polish glasses while eavesdropping, froze in place. The young truckers waited for some kind of reaction: anger, frustration, maybe even an attempt to leave. Anything. Charlie, however, remained still. He stared at the spilled coffee for a long second. Then, slowly, deliberately, he wiped the liquid off the table with his calloused hand. The air grew thick with tension. The blonde kid forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow now. "Oh man, come on. Don't tell me you're actually getting mad, old-timer." Charlie set his cup down. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "You boys want to know what trucking is really about?" The young men leaned in, expecting more jokes. They were about to learn their biggest lesson yet. Charlie exhaled slowly, then placed both hands on the table, his knuckles scarred and thick from decades of hard work. The young truckers were still grinning, but the laughter had faded. Something had shifted. "You boys think trucking is just about pushing a pedal and letting computers do the work," he said, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of something deeper. "You think it's all about horsepower and who's got the shiniest chrome." The blonde kid smirked. "Well, isn't it?" Charlie chuckled, but there was no humor in it. He leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with the kid. "I ran loads through Death Valley in the summer, in rigs with no air conditioning, hauled steel through the Rockies in blizzards that would have sent you boys crying home. I've driven 48 hours straight to make a delivery, back when dispatch didn't care if you lived or died, just that the load got there." The young truckers shifted uncomfortably. The bar was dead silent. Charlie rolled up his sleeve, revealing a deep, jagged scar running down his forearm. "That's from changing a tire on the side of I-80 when a chain snapped. Almost lost my arm. But I kept going, because that's what a real trucker does." Travis swallowed, his earlier confidence wavering. Charlie took one last sip of his coffee, then stood up. The way he moved, slow, deliberate, powerful, made it clear. He wasn't just some washed-up old man. He was the real deal. He looked at each of them, one by one, and then said, "Now, which one of you wants to teach me how to drive?" Nobody said a word. The bar was silent. The young truckers, who had been laughing and mocking just minutes ago, now sat stone-faced. The weight of Charlie's words hung in the air like a storm about to break. The blonde kid shifted in his seat, his smirk now gone. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the moment. "Look, old man, no one's saying you haven't put in your time, but times change. Maybe it's time for you to move on." Charlie just stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then he pulled a toothpick from his pocket, rolled it between his fingers, and placed it between his teeth. "You boys ever heard of the Devil's Pass?" Charlie asked, his voice slow and steady. The young men glanced at each other, unsure. Charlie leaned in slightly. "Narrowest damn stretch of highway in the Rockies. No guardrails. One wrong move, and you're 1,000 feet down in a ravine. I ran that pass with a full load in the dead of winter, when the road was nothing but ice. Had to chain up on a slope so steep it felt like I was climbing a mountain. And I did it without GPS, without lane assist, and without crying about how tough it was." The room was dead quiet now. Charlie smirked. "So tell me again how I don't know how to handle today's rigs." The blonde kid's jaw clenched, his earlier bravado crumbling. The other young truckers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Charlie's gaze. The bartender, who had been pretending not to listen, let out a low chuckle. "Sounds to me like you all just got schooled." The young truckers flushed red. Travis, the one who had knocked over Charlie's coffee earlier, stood up suddenly, trying to salvage his pride. Yeah, cool story, old man," he muttered. "But trucking ain't just about who can survive a snowstorm. It's about being efficient, being smart." Charlie nodded. "You're right, it's about being smart, like knowing when to shut your mouth before you embarrass yourself." A few of the older truckers sitting at the bar grinned. Someone let out a whistle. The young men were now visibly squirming. The tables had completely turned. Charlie took out his wallet, pulled out an old, faded CDL card, and tossed it on the table in front of them. "See that?" he said. "That's a lifetime certification. You know how you get one of those?" The blonde kid muttered, "By driving a long time?" Charlie grinned. "By never wrecking, never missing a load, never backing down." The blonde kid looked down, unable to meet Charlie's gaze. Charlie stood up, adjusted his worn-out trucker cap, and tossed a $20 bill onto the table for his coffee. "Tell you what," he said, turning toward the bar, "you boys buy me a drink next time you want to learn something real about trucking." He turned toward the door and walked out. The young truckers sat there, completely silent, their egos left in the dust. As Charlie stepped out of the Roadhouse and into the cool evening air, the door slowly swung shut behind him, leaving the group of young truckers in stunned silence. Inside, the laughter and arrogance that had filled the room minutes before had been replaced with something elsey quiet realization. They had underestimated the old man. They had thought trucking was just a job. They thought age meant weakness. But Charlie had just given them a lesson that no amount of modern technology or driving school could ever teach. One of the young men, the one who had been laughing the loudest, leaned forward, picking up Charlie's faded CDL card. He turned it over in his fingers, studying it as if it was some artifact from another time. The bartender, who had seen plenty of cocky young drivers come and go, shook his head with a smirk. "Y'all just met a real trucker," he said, wiping down the counter. "Not the kind that brags about miles or talks big about horsepower. A man who's seen it all, done it all, and doesn't need to prove it to anyone." Travis, the one who had knocked over Charlie's coffee, ran a hand through his hair, frustration written all over his face. How the hell are we supposed to compete with guys like that? An older driver, sitting at the far end of the bar, chuckled and leaned back in his chair. "You don't," he said simply. "You learn. You shut your mouth, you put in the miles, and one day, if you're lucky, you might have half the experience that man does." The young truckers sat in thoughtful silence. For the first time, they realized that trucking wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. It was about the road itself, about respect for the job, for the danger, and for the men and women who had paved the way before them. Meanwhile, outside, Charlie climbed into the cab of his old but well-maintained rig. He adjusted his cap, letting out a quiet chuckle to himself. He'd seen their kind before, young, cocky, thinking they knew it all. And he knew that some lessons can't be taught with words only, with time and experience. He fired up the engine, the familiar rumble beneath him feeling like home. The open road stretched out ahead, waiting. As he pulled out of the lot, he glanced once more at the Roadhouse in his mirror. Those boys would be talking about tonight for a long time. And maybe, just maybe, the next time they ran into an old-timer at a truck stop, they'd show a little more respect. What about you? Have you ever underestimated someone, only to realize later that they had more experience and wisdom than you thought? Or maybe you've been in Charlie's shoes mocked by someone who didn't know any better. Drop your stories in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. And if you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more true tales from the road. Because out here, experience isn't just a badge it's earned mile by mile.